Hi everyone, this is Dragon GGY. At long last, we are here. Wiš'adel is a never-before-seen, perfectly rounded operator that changed the ecosystem of Arknights. She has redefined what a damage dealer can accomplish in this game. We all know she's busted, but she's actually very well designed mechanically as well. Let's break it down in this operator Hindsight. Wiš'adel is a 6-star flinger in the sniper class. Trait of the archetype, attacks deal 2 instances of physical damage to ground enemies. Spoiler alert, usually ground enemies in a 0.9 tile radius. The second instance is a shockwave that does 50% of attack. That's a half of attack scale. So let's learn more about the damage and shockwaves. First of all, the standard attack of this archetype is an AoE physical damage with a 0.9 tile splash radius, which is the smallest comparing other archetype that can do splash damage. We have Fortress, Artillery, and Earthshaker at 1 tile radius, and Splash Casters at 1.1 tile. Having 2 instances of damage per attack means that they are also a good tool against mechanics related to damage instances. It gets better with the X module, which gives them an additional shockwave, increasing the damage instance to 3 per attack. However, the thing with shockwave is that they only deal 50% of attack. That's pretty bad for physical damage. For an 800-ish attack, shockwave will be doing 400-ish damage, which gets eaten by defense very soon. So low DPH is generally a major problem for this archetype. Rosmontes have a defense ignore talent to tackle that, but that wasn't helping her out a lot. That said, Flinger is still an archetype full of potential. Given high attack, which honestly Rosmontes didn't have back when they designed her, shockwaves can have high DPH as well. If they are given target count increase, having targets close to each other can trigger multi-splashing, and that amplifies their optimal damage by a lot. And that's the reason why Rosmontes skill 3 can achieve up to 171k damage on paper. If any of these properties are featured in a Flinger's kit, the damage efficiency will be upped a whole level. And you guessed it, Wiš'adel has both of them. Now, let's dig into Wiš'adel's talents, which are 2 of the most cracked talents in this game. They contribute to like more than half of her greatness. Talent 1, attack is increased to 115% of attack and applies an after image to the main target. When a target with after image is hit by Wiš'adel's shockwave, it has a 15% chance to cause an explosion, dealing 150% of attack, 160% at potential 5 as physical damage to surrounding enemies and stunning them for 0.5 seconds. A few notes: the main target attack scale, the 115%, applies to both the primary damage and shockwaves. After image has an infinite duration on enemies and is removed when Wiš'adel leaves the field. The explosion from this talent actually has a 1.1 tile radius, slightly wider than her attacks. Explosion damage, as well as the sun, can affect aerial enemies, so you can blow a hovering enemy down from an explosion, which is a welcome surprise, but it only starts here. Before everything, to not get you confused, let's use a diagram to better differentiate shockwave and explosion, which can get confusing. Shockwave is the secondary damage from Flinger's trait, the half of damage. When a target with after image is hit by this damage, which can be from themselves or other close by targets, it has a 15% chance to trigger an explosion. Explosion has a bigger effect range than shockwave and is the damage from Talent 1, can hit aerial enemies. With that clear up, let's talk a bit about damage order, which can be very confusing, but at the same time is a very important part of her kit. So every time the primary damage from an attack registers, the ensuing shockwave and explosion damage will happen all on the 4th frame after that. But even when they are all in the same frame, the game still has to process those damage one by one. However, this can be highly counterintuitive, okay? Even though explosion is technically triggered by a shockwave, the damage from explosion is calculated ahead of shockwave, and shockwave damage, 2 of them with module base, is processed next. If you get this, let's move on to multi-target. Even though shockwave is a splash damage where you would expect all enemies splashed will take the same damage at the same time, The game still has to process those damage in order, and for shockwaves, that order is randomized and not saved to autos. It isn't uncommon, but it becomes significant when explosion is a thing. Explosion damage, unlike shockwave, the order of its splash target taking damage is actually fixed, and is always in the reversed order of them spawning, meaning that if enemy 1 and enemy 2 here is spawned in this order 1 to 2, then when they are damaged by the same explosion, the game will process their damage taken in the order from 2 to 1. Now, these mechanics contribute to quite some phenomenon. Number 1, breaking autos. This happens when a shockwave splashes on multiple enemies, and is more significant off-skill where explosions are not guaranteed. Like we said, damage from the same shockwave applies to different enemies in a randomized order. Sometimes 1, then 2, sometimes 2, then 1. And since the explosion trigger determination in Talon 1 is dependent on shockwave, but shockwave behavior is not saved to autos, it will cause a chain effect, making the explosion triggers also not saved to auto when it's affecting multiple enemies. This is possibility 1 of why auto changes with Wiš'adel. Number 2 is a phenomenon that is called the higher the damage, the lower the damage. To break this down, let's see how damages are being processed by the game in a skill 3 scenario. Suppose there are 2 close by targets who both have afterimage on them. When Wiš'adel attacks, a primary damage is applied to both of them. That's not a problem. 4 frames later, the shockwave from this attack happens, but because the game has to randomly decide who will be hit by the shockwave first, it leads to 2 different outcomes. If the game decides that target 1 should take shockwave damage first, remember we said explosion damage is processed first, so even though we're talking about taking shockwave damage, the game calculates explosion damage before it. And because explosion damage order is always in the reverse order of target spawning, it will be 2, then 1, no matter what. So, the game thinks target 1 takes shockwave damage first, so the explosion on target 1 happens first. This explosion damage is applied to target 2 first, then target 1. Note that this is the same instance of damage despite applying to targets in order, which I use this dotted line to indicate. After this explosion is settled, the game will move on and finally register the shockwave damage on target 1. Now that is done, it's about time that this same shockwave hits target 2, which triggers the explosion on target 2. So now the game will process that damage again on target 2 first, then target 1, before finishing with the shockwave damage on target 2. All of this happened on the same 4th frame after primary damage is applied. You won't be able to tell visually at all, it's just that the game processes it this way. So now, if we look at the outcome when the game decides that target 2 should take that shockwave damage first, again, explosion damage order fixed, 2 then 1. Target 2 then, as designated, take the shockwave damage. And when the game moves on to applying that same shockwave to target 1, it triggers the explosion on target 1, causing target 2 to take that damage first, again, then 1. It finishes with the shockwave damage on target 1. If you can get that logic by now, let's put it in a more practical context. Suppose that target 1 has about like 75% HP, with target 2 is low at about 25%. If the shockwave order is target 1 first, explosion will happen on target 1 first. Then target 2 takes the explosion damage first, which in this case is enough to kill them. Target 1 proceeds to take the same damage as well as the shockwave damage on itself. Now, supposedly, the game should then get on the shockwave on target 2, but because target 2 is now dead from the previous explosion, the explosion on target 2 cannot happen, which leads to target 1's survival. In the opposite case, however, if target 2 is the one who gets the shockwave determined first, they will still die to that explosion damage, which applies to target 1 afterwards. Target 2 doesn't get the shockwave damage, of course, but their job is done. The game proceeds to hit target 1 with shockwave, who's still up and alive, triggering the explosion and shockwave damage on them, which is enough to kill them. So in 2 seemingly equal scenarios, such little gimmick brings the difference of life and death. So is this a big problem for using her? Not really, it's just explaining the phenomenon. Nothing much players can do about it, and she's gonna blow up everything in the end most of the time. Just something interesting that can explain your broken autos. So in case you're not aware, we're still in Talent 1. This is the core of her damage, introducing an extra AoE damage by utilizing her trait design with shockwaves instead of relying completely on them for damage. So that partly solved the problem of DPH with shockwaves, while boosting her DPS off skill and the damage potential of her skills, which we will talk about more in skill 3. It creates a means to affect aerial enemies, although not really reliable. It also stuns enemies, which keep them in range, so she may finish them off. Talent 2, after deployment, summons a Revenant Shadow within attack range, obtains Camouflage while in the adjacent 4 tiles to the summon. First of all, the summon deploys 1 second after Wisadel herself, which is when the 1 second window where a newly deployed unit cannot be targeted ends. So, barring some extreme cases, Wisadel will always be safe even when she Hala drops on enemies. She can have up to 3 summons on field, which is only possible by skill 3, but I figure I should just put it here. On the right is the stats of the summon. They have a similar stats line to, yes, a 6-star Guardian without module. That's pretty absurd, especially with that 650 defense and a whopping 50 resistance, making them quite durable against cheap range attacks. And that becomes evidently important when you consider that they can absorb enemy taunt when further summoned from skill 3. They do not block enemies, so they are safe from melee attacks, and they can be deployed on both melee and range tiles, so they can better stick around Wiš'adel to keep her camouflaged. Do note that they don't attack aerial enemies. Now, the summons do have a fixed pattern of where they will appear. First of all, they can only be in Wisadel's range, and the direction we're talking about next is relative to the map instead of Wisadel, so it's not affected by where she's facing. The logic of the deployment follows this priority. Number 1, the closer to Wisadel the better. Number 2, with the same distance, they prefer tiles below. And number 3, with the same altitude, they prefer tiles on the left. So if we use this 3x3 grid, for example, the adjacent 4 tiles are obviously closer. This makes sense because you want them to be next to Wisadel for the camo. Then, because the lower the better, the first summon will always want the tile below Wisadel. Next, the tiles on her left and right are of the same level, so the left one gets the priority. Finally, the tile above. Then for the further 4 tiles, using the same rule, you should be able to make out the rest of the priority. The diagram here shows the full summon logic. Of course, in an actual environment, not all the tiles are available. It just demonstrates the overall principle. The lighter the color of the tile is, the closer they are to Wisadel and higher the priority. For tiles of the same color, the number indicates their priority. It's very important to learn this rule so that you can keep both Wisadel and her summons alive, or use the summon to bait enemy skills and attacks. If you think you've mastered it, here's 2 homework for you. Try to tell the numbers of the tiles that her 3 summons will pick, and in what order are they deployed. Other than the deployment logic, the summon itself has some very interesting designs. Again, they don't attack aerial enemies and will only attack enemies in Wisadel's attack range, no matter where they are. They don't actually do auto attacks, the attack behavior is their skill. They do arts damage and will apply after image and slow for 1 second to their target. After that, they randomly gain 0 to 2 SP, while the skill requires 5 SP and has a 0.2 second lockout time. They also prioritize attacking enemies who don't have after image yet. You should definitely be surprised at how detailed their design is. The slow they apply is another way to keep enemies in range or delay the ones who are in front so that they stumble behind, gather with other enemies so that Wisadel can splash them easier. It also provides extra means to apply after image, which is a massive synergy with Talent 1. Not only that, the randomized SP plus the prioritizing targets without after image is a genius design. Randomized SP means that different summons finish charging their skills at different time points so that they attack one after another to minimize the chance of targeting the same enemy, which is in line with their target priority. It greatly increases the efficiency of applying after image to multiple targets in range, so that when Wisadel attacks, it's a massive explosion party downrange. I honestly have to give it to them for this design. This is beautiful and delicate. Overall, this talent is an enormous survival bonus for Wisadel as a range operator. She's safe from everything except splash damage. The summon has a crazy tankiness to ensure that stays true, absorbing taunt and range damage while being able to be resupplied by skill 3. It has a fixed deploy pattern that players can manipulate and directs you to find an optimal spot for deployment. It provides micro CC to facilitate more splash damage between targets, combined with the fact that they apply after image to create more AoE explosions. That's the origin of Wisadel's massive damage potential. And with that, we are finally done with her two talents. They are both top of the class, have big synergy with each other, and work perfectly with her kit. So let's talk about her module. Base effect now deals an extra shockwave damage, and upgrades further increase the main target attack scale and brings a 25% increase to the explosion attack scale, which at this point is becoming scary. Before everything, I will point out that the base effect for Flinger X is a very strong upgrade, both in terms of mechanics and damage. For Wisadel, because her Talent 1 explosion is determined on every shockwave, 2 shockwaves will increase the chance of explosion in one attack from 15% to 27.75%. In terms of damage, it's also a huge boost for her because her shockwaves can enjoy the attack scale from Talent 1 as well as massive bonuses in skill 3. So each extra shockwave is some extra big damage. Nothing more to say about the upgrades, it's just all-out damage improvements. Overall, Wiš'adel with this module has an off-skill DPS of 1,894, up from 1,350. Would you listen to that number? Her attack interval is shortened from 2.1 seconds to 1.97 seconds. Her skill 3 DPS, which should be most players' primary concern, is increased by more than 50%. This is one of the most improving modules in the game, same as what we used to say about Rosmonte's module, because level 1 is busted as a base effect. In short, level 3 is recommended for all players. From the perspective of spending on the best, this is no doubt the #1 priority. And for players who may be interested, I do recommend trying out using Wisadel without her module if you are hesitant about using her due to her massive power. I promise it will be a whole different experience. Now let's move on to her skills. Skill 3, no doubt the best damage skill in the game currently. Insanely high DPH, massive strike range, anti-air. Skill 2 is a very promising skill with low DPH but high DPS, potential for multi-splashing. It's just massively overshadowed by Skill 3 in most circumstances. Skill 1 is a pretty okay AFK skill, works with Landon, which has been a while, but lacks advantage on both DPS and DPH. Skill 1, the next attack costs 2 additional shockwaves and stuns the target for 1.5 seconds. The attack splash radius is increased to 1.1 tile and shockwaves damage is increased to 120% of attack. This is a 0/2 offensive recovery skill, hence compatible with Landon and Chen's talent. Stats can be found in this table. The expected cycle DPS, since explosions are not guaranteed, is 2098, which is not too shabby to be honest. This is the only case where shockwaves do higher damage than the primary damage, but even that, it's just 1.3k DPH. Do note that damage numbers in this video are all towards the main target unless specified otherwise, and the damage from summons is not included other than the auto attack DPS that we talked about a while ago. Quickly going over the pros and cons about this skill. Pros, it's AFK with respectable DPS. We usually use Blaze's skill 2 as reference, which has 2k DPS, and this skill is on par with that. It has a good range and is effective against mob hordes. Cons are also obvious. Low DPH, so that part is unlike Blaze's skill 2. It stems from the lack of attack bonuses, which also limits the effectiveness of talent explosions, since they are a key part of her damage. Also, there's no active means to replenish summons. If you want to increase the effectiveness of this skill, you can try offensive bonus like Skadi Alter skill 2, or cycle buffs like Landon from Makito or Chen's talent. You can also use her in a 4 sway team with Shu, which combines both of the above. Skill 2, attack interval minus 0.7 seconds into 1.4 seconds. Attack plus 35%, attacks 3 enemies simultaneously. When in overload, which means the latter half of the skill duration, attacks become 4 consecutive strikes with 80% of attack. No longer attacks 3 enemies, but instead randomly attack targets within range. This skill can be manually deactivated. This is a 15/25 25-second auto skill. Stats are shown here. This skill also doesn't have a big attack bonus, with the DPH in overload even lower than pre-overload, but still, this skill is expected to do 154k damage to a single target with a 6167 TPS. Under optimal circumstances, the total damage from triple splashing can bring the total damage to a maximum of 236k. You can also notice how the difference between with and without module is almost double in this skill, which is a cumulative effect from hit counts. Let's break down the skill. The first 12.5 second pre-overload is a multi-splashing phase, and the optimal scenario is when 3 targets are close by. Since 3 attacks are launched at each of them, they all take 1 share of main target damage, which goes directly for them, and 2 shares of splash damage from their friends next to them. That will make the expected damage go to nearby 3-fold than when it's only 1 target. This is the same principle to Rosmonte's skill 3's potential damage, utilizing extra targets to amplify damage to each of them. So this phase has the best performance when targets are close to each other. The second phase, Overload, is instead for bursting down a single target. It's a very similar pattern to Exiles skill 3. Sometimes the final hit of the consecutive 4 hits in the last attack can be lost due to distance or frame drops, so in practice there may be some damage lost. This phase features an expectation of 131 damage instances, including primary damage, shockwaves, and explosions. With that many hits but an overall low DPH, damage will be lost drastically against enemies' climbing defense, and cuts half by just 500 defense. But on the flip side, you can also say that increasing attack will significantly improve DPH and effectiveness against those enemies. Most importantly, this phase is best when it only hits 1 target, so that the main target scale is in effect. The overall design of the skill is using the first phase to kill off mob hordes, while multi-splashing will maximize the damage on that 1 or 2 thick target within the horde. After that, switching to a single target burst to focus fire on that 1 target. Therefore, this skill is good against low defense enemies or mechanics or gimmicks that requires more damage instances. You want mob hordes that splashes on each other as well. And if anything, this skill does have skill cycles twice as fast as skill 3. If that's needed, then it would be a good pick as well. I recommend using skill 2 when you have massive attack stats, for example in IS with tons of relics, or when you actually want to boost her, because this is the best candidate out of all 3 skills. You can use Hades skill 1, Wolverine, or Stainless. The buffs should focus on the overload phase. Finally, if you want to challenge yourself by not using skill 3, you should definitely try this one because it's an outstanding skill mechanically. And now, ladies and gentlemen, skill 3. Immediately summons 2 Revenant Shadows up to the limit of 3, and they persist after skill ends. Attack plus 180%, attack interval plus 2.9 seconds into exactly 5 seconds. Attack deals 220% of attack. Splash radius increases to 2.5 tile. Talent 1 trigger chance increased to 100%. The skill has 6 ammo and can be manually deactivated. This is a 35/50 auto skill. Most importantly, and it's not written anywhere, is that Wiš'adel herself will be able to target aerial enemies during skill 3. For Moina, skill 3 is not written in the rules, but for her, it's breaking the rules. I can only say that when they want to make an operator good, explanations are not required. Stats of the skill is shown here. Primary DPH is 6,730 on main target and 5,384 with splash damage. Even Shockwaves gets a DPH of 3,365 and 2,692 splash. Explosions also have a 4,527 DPH. All of them combined builds up to a total damage of 108k, but most of the time, it doesn't stop there. Let's dive deeper into the designs. We've all read the numbers. Primary damage, shockwaves, and explosions all have massive DPH and can tackle 99% of enemies in this game. Even as just splash damage, the damage from primary plus 2 shockwaves is enough to evaporate most grunts or even elites. However, when there are other enemies close by, more will be brought to the party. We know that extra summons will apply more after images to different targets other than the main one. Explosions are also bound to trigger in skill 3. The increased attack interval in the skill, in this case, is actually beneficial because it leaves time between her attacks for summons to apply after images, so that each attack will always trigger multiple explosions, amplifying total damage when targets are nearby, which is the scenario we showcased when we discussed Talent 1. For each extra explosion taken from a nearby enemy, that's 4.5k more damage added to the sum. Therefore, it does work well with kits that can bundle up enemies for multi-explosions, since the explosion radius is not increased by skill. So that's basically the mechanics explained. Here's why skill 3 is the dominant ceiling of all damage skills. 1. The range plus her AoE nature. Splash radius increase from 0.9 tile to 2.5 tile is outrageous. As visualized in this diagram, the splash area is increased by 7.7 times. Before, it's basically 1 tile coverage, whereas in skill, it's literally the Londinium defense artillery. That plus the fact that she deals damage to all enemies in range means that she can reach enemies in the far distance. That's coverage only behind some full map attackers, but she's definitely the most efficient one in wiping out a bunch of enemies from afar. Number 2, her survival. A ranged unit protected by camouflage means that she's not taking damage most of the time. Her summons are durable, persist after skill, and can be replenished. Number 3, her cycle and off-skill DPS. 10-second startup is decent, 50-second downtime is justified by her performance on and off skill. After the first skill use, Wisadel has the best off-skill DPS in the game with 3 summons on the field. Number 4, again, the nature of an ammo-based skill, less impacted by attack speed debuffs and doesn't lose damage spending time idle. That's everything needed to be said about this crazy skill. A lot of them is already foreshadowed by breaking down her talents. Just jump in game to feel the difference she brings to gameplay. In summary, Wiš'adel is a 6-star flinger who is an almost perfect AoE physical damage dealer. She provides destructive level of AoE splash damage in a gigantic range, has well-designed talent and skill mechanics that enables multi-splashing between available targets so that damage gets amplified the more enemies there are in range, which is pretty unique to Flinger and especially on her. Last but not least, she's backed up with the survival and damage support from her summons. So for performance in coming events, I can only say that the whole game is basically her playground ever since her release. You can use her in daily content to basically shut off your brain. She's pretty good against all the hordes in the standard RA, but do be careful of those enemies with ricochet damage. She does become less effective against bosses in high level, strange territory, and critical contention due to their high HP or defense, but that's relevant to a smaller player base. She's a starter, a bodyguard, and damage core in IS, basically the one pick that carries you the entire game. Her only weakness is the spike chest. They are going to insta-kill her from a distance, but I've got good news for you. They got removed in IS5. She has sweeping performance in low ops counts, currently holding close to 50 exclusive records. That's mainly due to her high off-skill DPS, as well as the cheating camouflage that ensures her survival. For impact ratings, I have revamped the rating system, which you can find detailed explanations from my last video. I have Wiš'adel at 10 as the ceiling of all operators. CM players call her a no-brainer for a reason. Most stages come to an end by using her skill 3 1 or 2 times, which is the same amount of effort to using Mountain or Typhoon for AFK. She has pretty decent survival on her own, so not only is Medic not required, but you can also just Halo drop her wherever she's needed and she'll do it just fine. Effectiveness is also quite easy to tell. You just need someone to take care of aerial enemies when she's off skill, and she is the most reliable operator you can have when you clear daily content now. I also have her at 10 with advanced content. Her specialization isn't that special, just big damage and big coverage. Her impact is dominant and proven in RA and IS. We don't have a CC to judge her yet, and it's likely her least advantageous mode because as a Flinger, shockwaves fall to attack debuffs and defense buffs very fast. But again, she may still win over with her range and survival advantages. Numbers are needless to say. Insane mechanics met with crazy numbers makes Wiš'adel. She does have a 50-second cycle, but with what she can offer, that's my problem, not hers. For pool analysis, it's just very straightforward. Just do it, unless you don't like her. Not gonna repeat those points again, just know that she can babysit most of your gameplay for a very, very long time. Can't really think of much cons other than saying that if you get used to using her, it does make you less sharp on how to play the game, maybe. On schedule and meta, again, she's dominant in all game modes ever since her release, and it doesn't seem like that's gonna change anytime soon. She's the best operator to have, especially for newer players. That's basically it. I think her powers speak for herself. And that pretty much wraps up this episode. Logos' episode will be coming up next, hopefully before the banner ends as well. I have also made changes to the ratings based on the new rating system. If you think it's off from your expectations, perhaps give it some time for the ratings to settle as we get closer to their global release. That's gonna be it from me. Thank you for watching until the end, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.